Greetings, everyone. Good to be back on Integral Life Practice and to be doing this podcast. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I'm the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. And in addition to my work with Zen and writing, I've been doing men's work for a long time, for over 16 years, with a group that I belong to here in Boulder, Colorado. And I've also been leading men's intensives for the last couple of years with some colleagues of mine. And we just had one that wrapped up 2 weeks ago, and I really began to see for the first time some larger themes, both in my life and in the lives of the men that I've been working with and in a group with. And it's around this idea of vulnerability. But before I get into that, I just want to tell a little story. So back when I first moved to Boulder, it was like 2006, I believe. And I met this very iconoclastic Zen teacher named Junpo Dennis Kelly Roshi. Some of you may have read my book. I wrote about him called A Heart Blown Open, his memoir. He was crazy. Very wise and very crazy guy. He passed away about 2 years ago. But I just sort of met him, and I was young. I was in my, 34, 35 years old, and really kind of dating, basically, for the first time. I had been in a relationship from 20 years old to 33 years old, married and whatnot. And so I hadn't basically dated since high school. And was really bad at dating in high school, so I was very inexperienced. And so I was dating this woman at the time, and boy, it was just like a totally explosive relationship. And I would just constantly lose my shit, sort of get triggered by things and blow my top, and just behave really immaturely. And the behavior was sort of surprising to me because I'd never really done that before in my life. And so one day I was talking to Junpo, and I was like, man, she drives me effing crazy, this happened and this happened. And so I'm basically just complaining about the relationship and saying how hard it is and saying how angry I am all the time. And he listens for a little bit, and he looks at me and he says, "You must really care about her." And it really set me back on my heels. I'd been talking to my friends about it, and talking to mentors about it, and no one had said that to me. Oh, you must really care. And so that began, what became a long relationship with me and Junpo, where he sort of helped me unpack some of these things, which is a little bit of what we're going to get into today. And just as a reminder, if you're on this call, I will be opening it up for questions at the end. So if you have a question, jot it down, and you're welcome to hop on at the end of the call, and we can talk about whatever. So vulnerability. So what is vulnerability? I bet that you may have a hard time defining it, especially if you're a man. What is vulnerability? To state the very obvious, at least in America, we are very much taught to hide anything that might be approaching vulnerability, physical vulnerability, emotional vulnerability, mental vulnerability, anything that makes us look weak. We are very much taught to cover that shit up and pretend things are okay, and fake it until you make it. That's very much the cultural conditioning. I mean, certainly for men, less so for women, speaking in general stereotypes, and maybe that's shifting with the younger generations. I don't know. I'm now old enough that I'm losing touch with them. But certainly that was the case for Gen X and for most of the older millennials that I know. So there's this idea that vulnerability is linked to weakness, right? Seems pretty obvious. And not only is vulnerability linked to weakness, vulnerability seems like it's one of those mutually exclusive states, right? Like drunk or sober, or awake or asleep, or alive or dead. You sort of have one or the other, and vulnerability seems like it's one of those dyads. That you're either vulnerable or you're powerful. You're vulnerable, or you're in control. Whatever, right? But vulnerability and things like self-assurance, confidence, control, clarity, directionality, right? We don't associate them. They seem like they must be mutually exclusive. And especially if we're men of a certain age, I would challenge you to find a single example in popular culture of a man who is in his vulnerability, which we haven't really even defined yet, but, in his vulnerability, whatever that means, and in his power at the same time. So in other words, he's not posturing, and he's not collapsing. He's not the overstrong man. He's not the overweak man. Who are our cultural icons, the people we look to, right? Good luck. Good luck finding them. And maybe there are some out there in the younger generations. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear. But there weren't any for mine. So I was really fortunate when I joined this men's group back in 2000 whatever 7, something like that, here in Boulder. I was invited by a good friend of mine. His name's Casey Capshaw, and Casey had this innate capacity to be both incredibly vulnerable, which is sort of incredibly in his heart, and incredibly masculine and confident and strong at the same time. And for him, it's just some weird innate way of being. I don't know where he got it from. I don't know why he's like that. But it was really inspirational to me because he was the only man that I ever knew that could hold these dyads, vulnerability and power, vulnerability and strength, vulnerability and masculinity, vulnerability and clarity. He's the only one I knew that could hold them simultaneously. And it made him a very uniquely powerful kind of man, and still does. He's one of my closest friends in the world. But for the rest of us, it's not so easy. So let me peel this apart a little bit and unpack what vulnerability is and see what's under the hood. And so typically with men and the men I work with, they're really good at doing three things, and they really only react three ways to any given trigger in the world or big stressor in the world, right? They get angry, F you. They collapse into shame, F me, or they dissociate, they go away, right? They sort of numb out, the fire goes out of the eyes and they disappear, and maybe an hour or 2 days later, they'll then get angry or feel ashamed. But those are the three: fight, flight, freeze, right? Sort of basic neurobiology, which we won't get into. But those are the emotional reactions and the things that most men are in touch with on some level. A lot of the work I do in men's work is, men feel like they're out of touch with their anger, they're afraid of their anger, or like me, their anger controls them. Not me anymore, but me back in 2006. So they start off on that surface level, and they see their anger, they see their shame, or they see their dissociation. They see that they don't have any choice in those things, right? They fly into a rage or they collapse into shame, and they come to men's work for some version of, how do I get on top of this thing? How do I understand it? How do I control it? And what I redirect them to is, you're not looking to control this thing, you're looking for a choice point to where you can choose how to respond rather than react to a situation. And the thing that Junpo taught me, the story I told at the top of this call, is that you can't get angry if you don't care. It's actually not possible. So I'm going to make an absolute statement, which I very rarely can make, but it's absolutely true. And I've never found anyone who has a counter argument to this. No one has ever gotten angry who didn't care first. It's not possible. You cannot get angry if you don't give a shit about something. Which is fascinating. Even the poor mentally ill guy on the corner shaking his fist and yelling at the cars going by, right? He cares. He really cares about whatever he's yelling about. If he didn't care, he wouldn't be yelling at the clouds, right? So this is a fascinating fact. And this ties us into what vulnerability actually is. I asked at the top of this call, what is vulnerability? I would imagine most of you, if you're honest, kind of went, I don't really know what vulnerability is. I just know I don't really want to be running it in public or running it online or running vulnerability in the office or running it at the next board meeting. Not safe places to be vulnerable. But I'm going to challenge you and say it is a safe place, because the reason it doesn't feel safe is because you don't understand what it is. And all vulnerability is care. That's it. You fucking care about something. And the care, which arises first, so there's a stimulus out in the world. Your wife yells at you. Your boss yells at you. You get a bad financial quarterly report. Whatever. Shit happens. The first thing that arises in your body mind, very first thing, is care. You care about it. But what happens is our minds move so quickly these days, and we're so conditioned to not feel vulnerable, especially men, that we never notice the care. Care goes right by, not conscious. And what happens if a man feels deep care about something, but it's not conscious? Well, the next step is his cultural conditioning, right? Shit from his childhood or whatever, his culture kicks in, and he reacts to the care. Boom. Stimulus, care, unconscious reaction. F you. I get angry. I get angry so I don't have to feel the care. Or F me, I collapse because on some level I'm kind of terrified of my wife or terrified of my boss. Or lights go out. Nothing. In all three cases, the first thing that happened was care. That's vulnerability. That's it, right? So, and I don't think we've done or are doing a very good job of teaching ourselves how to be in touch with this care, because the title of this talk was The Power of Vulnerability. The power the power of being in touch with my care is that I go from being really noisy to you, F you, buddy, or really noisy to me, F you, Keith. If I'm in touch with my care, and I tell the men I work with, all you need is a pinky finger on the care, just a pinky finger on the care, a little through line in your consciousness to tell the truth. I care about this. It really matters to me. And what that does is it opens up some sort of weird little channel to the heart. And anger goes from being noisy and very much about you being a problem that I need to fix. And it gets transformed into clarity. And clarity is clear. It's not noisy, right? It means I'm connected to myself, I'm connected to you, and I'm connected to my care. And it radically changes conflict of every kind. When you're in touch with your care, that is your vulnerability. And when you're in touch with your care as a man, it transforms anger into clarity. And it transforms shame or collapse also into clarity. In both cases, in one case with anger, the man is leaned too forward, sort of pushing into the person or the thing he's angry at. And with the shame dissociation, he's too far leaned back, he's afraid of it. And in both cases, what the care does is you stand upright. You stand in your dignity. And now you're owning the fact that you have skin in the game. You care about something. And I might say, hey, Bob, can I talk to you for a minute? you did this thing the other day at work, and I got to tell you, man, like it really didn't land well with me. You mind if I tell you why? Right? That's what anger can look like. Your anger can be clarity, and it can be an invitation to a conversation with someone rather than an accusation, informing them of what they did wrong and why you're right and why you're justified in your anger. You know, I cringe when I see things. I see this with women's work a lot. Not a lot, but sometimes it makes me cringe. Cringe, though. Teaching people how to be angry. You know, I look at that and I go, oh my God, teaching people how to be angry. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, do we need more angry people in the world? Do we need more angry people on social media? Do we need more angry people with opinions about the Middle East? Are you pro-Palestine? Are you pro-Israel? Well, fuck the other side. The trouble with all of this, right, is that people aren't in touch with their care. And if I'm in touch with my care, it means I am owning the vulnerability that I feel in the position that I have about whatever politics, whatever. People aren't in touch with their care. It's in shadow. It's disowned. And so what do they feel instead? Righteous anger. And I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like to be around people that are righteously angry. It's not really my jam. They're not super fun people. Generally don't have a sense of humor. So all it means to be vulnerable is to tell the truth. I care. And you don't have to tell the truth to your boss. You don't have to be like, hey, Bob, I care about something. You know, that's ridiculous and childish, right? You're in touch with the care. You own the care. You hold it. You protect that part of yourself. Hey, I really care about this. Maybe I need to be skillful because it matters. It matters. Okay. So this is true in any place that you have conflict, which is, if you're anything like me, everywhere that you're interacting with life, there's some version of conflict, right? Work, social media, relationship, family, right? Conflict comes up. We're human. So I think that's really all that I have to say on it. It's a relatively simple message. Maybe the only thing I would add would be that, you know, if you're hearing this for the first time, if this is sort of new to you, like, whoa, shit, my anger is driven by care. Care arises first. If it's the first time, it's a practice to figure out how to bring this into your life in a way that's skillful. So you may need to work with a coach, therapist, a buddy, right? Work with me. I've got a couple men's groups that are open that I'm launching in a couple weeks. So go to my website if you're curious about joining an actual men's group that I'll be leading, keithmartinsmith.com. But it takes practice, and you will screw it up. You will definitely screw it up. So the idea isn't like you learn this and you get it right. The idea is you learn this and you practice it. And if you're anything like me or all the men that I've worked with over the years, which means it will be like this for you, you'll do it wrong. You'll forget. You'll blow up into anger, you'll collapse into shame, and you'll remember like a week later that like, oh yeah, shit, there was care there. I forgot. And then you practice more, and then instead of realizing a week later, you realize like 3 days later, and then you realize like, you know, a day later, and then eventually it's 3 hours later, and then eventually it's an hour later, and then eventually, because you're practicing, because it's a practice, you will be talking to someone, and you'll be angry, or you'll be sort of collapsing, you'll be doing one of those two things, and you'll remember, oh, wait a minute, I give a shit about this. And you'll run that thread over to just barely touch into your care, and you'll get the results for yourself. You'll get to see what happens. So, I think that's enough. If you have a question, you can use the bottom bar there. I think there's a way, I actually can't see it on my side, but I think it says call in or something. And I'll pop you up and we can have a little back and forth. And if you're feeling a little camera shy or your connection's slow, you can also just send me a chat which I can pick up. All right. So Eric said, please say more on implementing a practice for this. So Eric, what I would say is there a place in your life that you know you get angry or that you collapse into shame? And I'm sure the answer is yes. So you would look for a place, politics particularly. So great. Okay, so with politics is a great place because it's like it's easy for us to look out into the world and care a lot. To care about whatever's going on. The Middle East, the environment, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or being triggered by diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever it is, right? We look out, but we really care. So one of the practices you can have, Eric, is like when you feel yourself getting angry about what you're reading on social media, you can actually be willing to take the risk of just dropping into the care and just feeling the care. That can be the first practice. Because generally, if you feel the care, you feel the vulnerability. And when you feel the vulnerability behind the care, you start to figure out why people don't share the vulnerability on Facebook or Twitter, right? It's not a good medium to be sharing your care necessarily. That's kind of like sharing your care in the 8th grade football locker room might not be a good place to practice this either. You want to practice it in a place where you can just feel that the care is true for you. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. Yeah. And so with politics, it's really a self-practice. And if you feel the care, Eric, then like what often happens is you become a lot less reactive, right? Because you see that the person that you're mad at, that they care too, they just don't see their care. And so, when you're in touch with this, I can sit down with just about anybody whose politics might be very, very different than my own. But I know they give a shit. I know they care. So I can meet them in that place of care and we can have a great conversation. So Arthur, let's go ahead and you can turn your camera and your microphone back on. I'd love to hear your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Oh, hi. A question I had around vulnerability was being vulnerable is like almost kind of like being unsafe.
Sure.
So how can you be vulnerable and still feel safe? Because most time I know I go around with like an armor on, so I'm not vulnerable and it doesn't
Right.
go through.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I just partially answered that with Eric, right? Which is one of the things is the first thing is you tell the truth to yourself that you care and that the care makes you feel vulnerable. So the first step is you do those two things. I care about this and I feel vulnerable. Now I may choose to hide it. As I said, if I'm in an 8th grade football locker room with a bunch of middle school kids, I'm probably not going to share my deepest vulnerability. At least historically, I wouldn't, right? I might not go onto Twitter after this and be like, share my deepest care with the world. So part of it is practicing it with people that you care about. A really close friend, right? A lover, a colleague at work, kids. It's actually a great thing to share with your kids. If you're having conflict with your kids and you're mad at them and you're like, hey, I really love you and I'm really worried about this. And that's what's driving me doing whatever it is I'm doing to change your behavior. But if you're in touch with that care, it just softens everything, makes it more real. And it gives you more skin in the game. So to answer your question, skillfully, like you do it skillfully. I wouldn't do it at the next, football game I was at, like I said. Does that make sense? I think one of the things that makes this work tricky is being skillful in how we practice, because we want to give ourselves the experience of having a win. Like I do Qigong and martial arts. I have been for a long time, many decades. And in a Qigong practice, the idea, the sort of mantra is you always want to feel like the Qi is winning because you want to build your Qi up. So you don't want to get to a point where you feel depleted and weak. You want to experience the win. I do a hard Qigong where you're sort of hitting the body, right? But I don't want to hit so hard that I'm like, ow, and I collapse into discomfort because that's not building things, that's actually causing me pain. And this practice of touching in with the care and feeling the vulnerability, it's really the same kind of practice. You want to do it in a way where you feel the win. You feel the dignity and the power that your care and your vulnerability actually provide you. And you want to get to see the results, which is you actually get more of what you want. Eric is coming online here. Hey, Eric.
Hi. So yeah, let's just work a little bit with that piece around the anger at politics. And
Great.
so, just to disclose, my situation. I mean, I've been in integral spaces a lot. I have a very easy time with quite a wide range of views. I'm not triggered if somebody's a liberal or a conservative or this or that. I mean, for a general level of people who actually care about things, I'm pretty interested in finding out what they have to say. What challenges me are the people who are, like in the United States where I live, we've got a Congress where there's the burn it down folks, like a Matt Gaetz, for instance, or some of those people who are, you know, by my sense, fairly narcissistic, looking for media attention. They don't really care about serving in the capacity that they're elected to serve, and they just want to fuck it all up. And I have a hard time with nihilism, and so that's where how to work with something like that. It's a little different character than
No,
just
you're
saying like,
right.
oh, here's someone with a traditional consciousness, and they're this or that. I mean, I'm cool with all that stuff, but it's like I have a line, and this is where it's really my edge.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky, but even narcissists care, right? They just care about themselves. And that's the really hard part to be with. Or in the case of, what's going on in the Republican side of things here in the United States, it's a little unclear what the care is really about. It can seem like it has a pretty narrow, possibly even destructive focus. But what I try to do in all these situations, I've actually worked with some narcissists, and I've worked with people that have been victimized by a narcissist. And it's still the practice of trying to find the care that they have, which allows me to touch on the care that I have, which still allows a connection to happen. I might choose, and I would choose, to not be in a relationship of any kind with someone who had, a clinical narcissism going on, because it's not going to go very well until they become self-aware of it. But in a political situation, I would probably argue with you, Eric, that probably what's going on is you care. Obviously, you care about these sorts of things, but then you feel helpless. And the feeling of helplessness for some of us is a huge trigger, depending on like your family of origin story and whatnot. It is for me. It's like a really big trigger of mine. And so generally, if you feel care and then you feel helpless with the care, that there's nothing you can do to safely get that care across or create the kind of change you feel is needed, that helplessness can turn into a real, either intense anger or intense ejection out the back door, just trying to get away from the situation. Right? So like, but screw it, I'm not going to do politics at all. I'm going to go move into the woods and just let the country burn itself down. That might be a reaction to feeling helpless. You're actually in control of that. Or fuck those guys. I'm going to go online and I'm going to just talk to my friends about how toxic and destructive they are, and just listen to myself ramble and ramble. But either way, in my view, it's not being in touch with the truth of the helplessness that's actually there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, you're hitting something here that's good for me to look at. I mean, to the extent that I'm triggered about anything, I'm not going to be very capable of being of service. And so I need to do that work to get clear in me so that I'm not reactionary to whatever situation I'm in. But I think to recognize the helplessness aspect that, sometimes with, structural positions of power and things like that, one can feel that their hands are tied. It's very hard to accomplish something to, further what I care about. And, to come to a place of acceptance with that sometimes is hard. hard one to
Yeah,
swallow.
I mean, it's like
You know,
one of the
I
harder
could do
things.
my very best. I could be persuasive. I can be, you know, caring about the other person, listening to what, goes on with them. But it's not sufficient to open the doors to enact the kind of change that I care about. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I really hear that. I really do. And for me, this kind of practice that I'm talking about today very much dovetails into a contemplative or spiritual practice, which is the practice of being with what is and actually surrendering to sort of surrendering to the helplessness, which, it's like the situations in politics and what's going on, are going to pretty much go on no matter what you or I think about them. Right? 'Cause, we're not the president, and we're not, in some senior position. So for me, there's a practice of releasing and just allowing what's already happening, to just accept what's happening rather than resist what's happening. And in that, I feel some degree of opening and capacity to be with the feeling of helplessness and care that's so hard to be with.
yeah.
Right? It's like Buddhism
Yeah, I
101.
hear that.
When you resist what is,
Right.
you suffer. Yeah, it's like Buddhism 101.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
to
I
me,
like
it goes
that.
back
So,
to that really simple practice, which seems that doesn't sound so hard until we get into these things where you really care a lot and you realize you can't really do anything, and it sucks
yeah.
and it hurts.
So to take it another step is how do we hold, and this is where it gets kind of paradoxical of holding this place of like, I'm not in control. I need to surrender to what is and just accept that for what it is. And at the same time, have the drive to take action, knowing that it may not come to fruition, but to not lose that drive, because I can see where there could be a collapse and it's like, well, I can't really affect things. And that doesn't me feel very compelling either. So,
And well,
it's
that's
kind
the
of like
thing
in
about
that,
nihilism.
yeah, yeah. So then, to skillfully navigate that place of, passionately playing full out in a particular arena and recognizing I'm not going to, necessarily change it. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. And it's tricky.
I mean, to me, you nailed it. You used my favorite word, which is paradox. Which is I think that's it. I think it is a paradoxical practice where we fight to change the world to be the one that we believe is better, but at the same time, we do the practice of accepting the world exactly as it is because it can't be any other way. So why resist what is? You just make yourself crazy and you suffer. So yeah, I think that's the practice, and I think that practice keeps us humble because, as I like to say, every despot and terrible abusive guru and monstrous entity, they all believe that they were doing the right thing, and when we believe we're doing the right thing, it's always for me a good step of humility to be like, well, maybe I'm doing the right thing, but maybe I'm not. And so accepting things as they are helps me to stay humble in my righteousness that I know what the hell is going on and that things would be better if I got my way. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't.
Yeah, yeah. And so now we've got two things to work with. Is one, the humility to recognize that I only see things from my level, and from further rungs up the ladder, I might see things very differently and take a different course of action. So I'm taking action on something which I don't know is true, but to the best of my ability now is, and that I could perceive that perhaps it serves a little better than what I'm seeing, that's out there now. But here's where, as a practice kind of question, with the paradox of all of this, it's easier for me to sit back at the end of the day, reflect on the day, go into a meditative space, and find that accepting what is. To do those things simultaneously, the engaged action and the release, the surrender of attachment to the goals, with closer and closer time frames. To me, they're kind of like,
They're mutually exclusive.
It's a one or they're mutually exclusive, one or the other. It's like I can't be really passionate and then not give a shit at the same time. And I can maybe change that oscillation from start of the day to the end of the day, and I can maybe do practices where it's like, okay, now I'm going to really engage for an hour. Now I'm going to take an hour to do a mini meditation, but how to get those closer and closer so that I'm oscillating with a quicker frequency, if you will.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, totally. Totally makes sense. I mean, to me, it's the same practice as I said before, of touching in with the care and getting to that place where we realize that where we've reacted for our whole lives, we now have a choice, right? So care comes up, men typically explode into anger, collapse into shame, and they react. There's actually no consciousness there, right? I mean, it's a Pavlovian response to a stressor, and the lights are off the whole time. And usually until afterwards. Oh wow, I really blew my top, bro. Wow, I was really sort of collapsed there, But that's minutes, hours, days later. So the practice really is noticing when that happens in that instance, and as I said, practicing. So practicing with a practice partner, basically, or a coach. And it's the same thing for what you're talking about. It's like, you can have reminders, or you can have all kinds of things, or you can have someone that you work with that helps you practice holding both of these seemingly exclusive states at the same time, which you can do. And you do it by just bouncing back and forth really quickly until eventually they can sort of come up at the same time. So for instance, for me now, I'm in touch with my care enough that I very rarely get angry in the way that I used to. What I get is really clear. It's this like really deep sense of clarity. And I found the same thing in politics. And I found what's been helpful to me to touch into the acceptance is laughter, like sort of just laughing at myself. It's really helpful. Humility is so important. Of like, wow, I'm really upset about this, but like I'm just not that important. Like, there's something that is very like, yeah, man, you're really upset about the state of the world, and like, and what is that actually doing? You being upset, and then I sort of laugh at myself, and that's helped me to close that gap a little bit too. Not being so important as I would like to be, maybe. And it can help. Like when I work with men doing this, they'll tend to bring the thing that's a 10 out of 10 for them. Like, well, let me work on my mother. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Give me something that's a 2 out of a 10. And like let's actually get the practice of it, of feeling the feeling the win. Like I said, the qigong, like feeling the win, and like, oh yeah, that actually feels a lot better when I do the practice and I get the result. So that's another thing too. I wouldn't start with whatever, like the thing that's the most noisy, because that's going to be the hardest place to remember the practice. That's the divine joke, right? We think we're so important, and we are important, and we're not important too. Another paradox. All right, everybody. So I think we're gonna call it a wrap on that one. I appreciate your care, and I appreciate your attention, and I hope this was interesting to you. Again, if you want to learn more about me, keithmartinsmith.com. And I will be back the second Saturday in November, which I don't have the date on the top of my head, but I'll be talking with a good friend and colleague of mine. We'll be continuing the theme of men's work and some of the juicier bits in there. So I hope to see you guys next month. So goodbye for now.